Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's forum. We are delighted that so many of you have committed this hour to reflecting on the climate crisis. My name is Father Regis Smolko. I'm the priest in charge at St. Brendan's Episcopal Church in Franklin Park. Recently, I've attended a similar conference, and the speaker introduced it by saying that our primary task is no longer to tell people that climate change is happening or to make them worry about it. He said that they already know. They already are concerned, despite what some media outlets and politicians would have you believe. Public awareness of and concern about climate change is consistently high, despite the dumbing down of it and the trickery of so many prominent political voices in our country during the past few years. Around two-thirds of the U.S. public worry about climate change a great deal, or a fair amount, the questionnaires say, and they have done so for 2 decades. In the UK, there's a bit more advancement, as they say three-quarters are concerned. So the challenge doesn't seem to be awareness, it's action. Concerns exist, but do not influence day-to-day decisions. Rarely is climate change a critical factor in elections. People tend not to think about climate change when deciding how to travel, or how to invest their money, or which energy supplier to use. But tonight, this may change a bit for us as we spend some quality time with our speaker, Mr. Larry J. Schweiger. Larry comes with a vast knowledge of the problems and the actions needed to fix the climate crisis. As past president and CEO of the National Wildlife Federation, Penn Future, and Western PA Conservancy, Larry safeguarded the nation's wildlife against climate change. He worked with Vice President Al Gore to launch the Climate Reality Project. Collaborating with the late Senator John Hines, Larry played a critical role in the passage of the 1990 Clean Air Act, which curbed acid rain. He spent 30 days on the Gulf of Mexico in the middle of the BP spill, helping to get the story of America's largest oil spill to the public, which resulted in the Restore Act, which moved 80% of BP's penalty funds to restoration of the Gulf Coast. Larry is a person of action. He gets results. And at St. Brendan's Episcopal Church, we are so honored to have him with us tonight to suggest practical next steps for us to take and to do our part to help heal our broken environment. I asked Larry yesterday when we had the pre-meeting to this forum tonight what he had hoped your major takeaway would be after participating in tonight's forum, and he said this. He says, I hope they leave realizing that climate change is the greatest threat to humanity we have. And it's cheaper to deal with it than not to. We will shortly hear from Larry, who will present for about 25 minutes on the topic and from his latest book, Climate Crisis and Corrupt Politics. Later in the program, though, we will open up the discussion by responding to questions from you, the audience. You can send us your questions or comments at any time by chat or in the Q&A box on the bottom or sometimes the top of your screens. So at this time, I would like to pass the mic to Larry.
Well, thank you so much, Regis, and thank you for that very nice introduction. I've been following the activities of St. Brendan's for some time, and I'm so impressed with the fact that you're putting wheels to your faith. That's so needed today. We need to take a stand for the causes that are important to us. I'm really appreciative of what you and all your followers are doing. The climate crisis has been for me a moral moment for our shared values. I have long been concerned about this threat to nature. If I can get my slides to advance, I'll. Sorry about that. Something's acting up. Sorry about that. It's not responding.
I saw them flip there for 1 second.
There it goes. Pennsylvania has a notable history of what appears in retrospectively to have been a short-sighted exploitation of its bountiful environment, said Chief Justice Ronald Castile.
I hate to interrupt you, but Julie has a technical question. I don't think we're getting it coming through.
Oh my. Okay, hang on 1 second.
Yeah, I'm not seeing your slides.
Okay. Are we seeing it now?
Yeah.
Yes, we are.
Good.
Okay, let me move this over and I'll.
Yep, you got it.
I just got this. I need to get it to center. Here it goes. Okay.
Looking good on my screen. Yep.
Okay. If you look at our history, we mined over 10 billion tons of coal in Pennsylvania. So much of the carbon that's in the sky actually comes from Pennsylvania. We left behind, I say we, the miners have left behind over $10 billion worth of unreclaimed mine scars. So many communities across Pennsylvania are still living with these damages. We've seen generations die from cardiovascular disease, lung disease. And that's particularly true in urban and urban poor areas where people don't have a chance to escape to cleaner air. Pennsylvania has also seen enormous damage to its waterways. This map was produced in 1970 when I worked at the state legislature. At the time, we had over 10,000 miles of mine degraded streams in Pennsylvania from mining of coal. And the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and others have spent enormous amounts of money to clean this up. Pennsylvania taxpayers have spent hundreds of millions of dollars cleaning up from the unregulated coal industry. And we are continuing, surprisingly, despite that, to subsidize the fossil fuel industry by $3.2 billion in annual subsidies in Pennsylvania. We are also experiencing the rebirth of the gas and wet gas industry in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has a long history, in fact, the longest history of oil drilling in the world. We had the first oil well, we had the first oil refinery in the city of Pittsburgh. And at one time, more oil floated down the Allegheny River than was being produced and barged elsewhere. Currently, there are about 475,000 to 700,000 abandoned oil wells in the state. Estimates are that about 50,000 tons of methane leak into the atmosphere each year from these abandoned wells. That's about 5 to 8% of Pennsylvania's annual greenhouse gases. So we have a long history of degrading our environment. We also have a good history of researching the problem. Dr. Samuel Pierpont Langley and Dr. John Brashear developed some of the earliest carbon dioxide research using infrared techniques. And their work led to Savant Arrhenius in 1896 publishing in this philosophical magazine this warning that we're evaporating our coal mines into the air with so much carbon dioxide that it will increase, I'm paraphrasing, will increase the temperature by about 2 degrees Celsius. So that's clearly what's happening today. And that was warned over 100 years ago by some of the research that was done right here in Pittsburgh. The late Senator John Hines entered an article in 1978 about climate change and acid rain. I was the author of that article, and that took Hines into the effort of cleaning up acid rain, and we were able to tackle that in 1990. So we've had a long history in doing this. I've worked with both Republicans and Democrats, and I want to make that clear from the beginning. One of the challenges we have is that people believe that this is a partisan issue, that somehow this is a Democratic thing, and it's not at all. I work closely with the late Senator John McCain, who was our first sponsor of the acid rain, no, the climate change bill, not acid rain, climate change bill. And I honored Senator McCain for his efforts in that regard. And he was very clear with me that he saw it. He lived in Arizona. He had been to the Arctic 3 separate times. He was to the Antarctic. He was in the Greenland, and had hiked the Rocky Mountains and saw the bark beetle and fire damage. So Senator McCain was a champion. He was the first champion of the climate effort. And it's an example how Republicans and Democrats can come together and work together. I worked with Senator, later Vice President Al Gore in his efforts on acid rain, climate change, and all these other environmental issues. More recently, we launched the Climate Reality Project. We've trained over 30,000 people. Al has done most of that work and deserves enormous credit for that effort. I share that because portions of the United States have already surpassed the 2 degrees Celsius warning that scientists have been talking about for some time. And parts of Pennsylvania are also seeing dramatic temperature increases. The reason why we haven't been able to make progress on this is that the industry itself has worked very hard to keep us from doing the right thing. And I put the oil industry on the top of that list. Clearly, the money in politics has been an important impediment to making real progress. And I'm pleased that in recent hours that corporations have said they're going to suspend their investments in politics. I hope that stays with them. I hope they don't lapse back into a bad practice, because corporate money is a big part of the problem in Washington. This is Dr. Katie Walters, who is with the University of Alaska at Fairbanks. Katie's been studying particularly the wetlands in the Arctic region, because she knows that they are a very potentially dangerous source of methane. And this is Katie in Alaska at a wetland. She's actually going to punch a hole in the wetland. You can see that Katie and her interns had a close call. She had some singed eyebrows, but she'll be okay. But I'm not sure our world's going to be okay. We're also seeing the same thing in Siberia. These hunters in Siberia are witnessing a bubble under the grass in the Siberian tundra. And the Siberian region has been catching on fire in recent days. There's been enormous fires across the Siberian region of Russia. You can see the gas coming out of the ground as they deflate the methane bubble. There's been a number of explosions in the Siberian region, and methane underneath the ground builds up, and then something, probably a lightning strike, triggers it and blows these massive holes. You can see the people at the top of the screen there to give you an idea of the size of these holes. There are about 13 of them at the last check. Incidentally, the Arctic region has increased in temperature about 6 degrees to 12 degrees Celsius over the last 30 years. So we're seeing a very dramatic warm up of the northern real estate of this planet. In 2005, Dick Cheney and Halliburton and others worked to pass amendments to the energy bill to exempt fracking from the Clean Air Act, from the Clean Water Act, from the Safe Drinking Water Act, and altered a number of other really critical environmental statutes so that fracking could go forward without any federal oversight. And since that time, we've seen a dramatic increase in the number of frack wells in Pennsylvania and across this country where there's shale gas available. And I could go into the details of this. I won't, but just to simply say that those who live near these frack wells have children with babies with low birth weights, with other health implications, heart conditions. These are very risky places to be living nearby. And unfortunately, the Pennsylvania boundaries are not big enough to protect homeowners. So we're seeing increased problems in various places in Pennsylvania. This photograph happens to be Midland, Texas. I've flown over this area, and it's staggering the number of frack wells that we see in Midland, Texas. And that's not alone. There are a number of other places in this country where the frac wells are as abundant as they are in Midland. Since fracking was exempted from the federal environmental statutes, we've seen an explosion of natural gas, frac gas in the country. You can see the dramatic increases since 2005. And that was characterized as a cleaner energy. Fracking is not a cleaner energy from a climate change standpoint. It may be from an air pollution standpoint in some regards, but it's certainly not from the climate change standpoint. And so it's not a bridge to some future. It's really a dead end, as the people have suggested. And unfortunately, one of our lawmakers, Representative Turzai, who was Speaker of the House, worked with the other lawmakers and was able to get over $2.2 billion already on the way to the gas industry. And there's a possibility of up to $2.6 billion in subsidies. Meanwhile, we're not able to provide money for those who are struggling in poor neighborhoods, who are out of a job, who need food. And yet we're diverting tax revenue for the expansion of a polluting industry. Environmental disasters are on the rise. The insurance industry has noted this and has been taking whatever actions they can. When I was in Washington working on these issues, the reinsurance industry was supportive of our work and try to help us move the needle. Pennsylvania is already experiencing more 90-degree heat days than we used to. I grew up in Pittsburgh, so I know the history of the overall temperature situation. And clearly we're seeing an uptick. Last year, as an example, we had a really tough summer. And yet Pennsylvania will experience somewhere between 26 and 50 days a year with 90-degree plus temperatures by mid-century. And I think it's actually coming faster than predicted. We're also seeing storm intensities increasing year by year. And the reason for that is that the oceans are warming up. About 94% of the total energy of climate change is going into the oceans. The oceans are the big absorber of our heat, and every bit of the energy that goes into the ocean ultimately comes back out, and oftentimes brings water vapor and storms. We see increased storm events, particularly storm events that carry a lot more water. And those water-laden storm events move slower than they used to, and they drop a lot more water than they used to. So you can see that pattern developing. And just in the last 5 years, we've seen a dramatic uptick in the amount of water in the rainfall during these big storm events as the water comes off the Gulf. And incidentally, the Gulf of Mexico is sort of an entrapped system. It heats up much faster than the rest of the oceans because it's trapped water. It doesn't get a chance to move out into the Gulf Stream or other oceanic currents as easily as other waters. We're seeing these rain bombs where these massive accumulations of water accumulate in the sky and then are triggered into these storm events that are just unprecedented. And we're seeing those not just here in the US, but across the planet, oftentimes entrapping people and doing enormous damage. This happens to be McKnight Road about 2 years ago. And we've seen damage to many of our infrastructure systems in the region as a result of these intense storm events. We're also seeing landslides as we lubricate these rock and clay structures, particularly the red clays. We're seeing mass failures. And this happens to be one in Pittsburgh that was occurred during a whole series of weather events during the winter months. We're also seeing tick and mosquito migrations. This is one that's close to me. I've had Lyme disease now. My grandson has had Lyme disease. And we're also seeing some very dangerous mosquito diseases moving further and further north. We used to have winter kills that would wipe out the ticks, wipe out the mosquito populations, and those winter kills are not strong enough, not long lasting enough to suppress the insects. So we're seeing dramatic increases. Pennsylvania right now has more Lyme cases than any other state. And this happens to be my grandson. And I can tell you, it broke my heart when I found out that he had Lyme. he was playing in the same woodlot that I played in as a boy. I never had a tick on my body for all the years and all the hours that I spent in the woods. And I was addicted to the woods. I spent, most of my time there. And this little guy suffered from Lyme disease because he was doing what little boys do. We're also seeing other insects become a real danger. The pine beetle in the West has just exploded. We're also, if you look around, most of the spruce trees in our area are dying. They're dying because insects and other diseases have overwintered and are taking out our trees. And so we're seeing a vast die-off in British Columbia and all throughout the West into California and all the way south in our country. We're also seeing an enormous increase in fires. When I was an advisor to the U.S. Forest Service and the Department of Agriculture, and they submitted a report to our committee showing us that we're going to see a doubling of forest fires in the next few years. And that's already starting to happen in a very dramatic way. We've all seen it. The fire season today is 105 days longer than it was in 1970. And so when you have these long fire seasons, you have more chances of fire. Back a few years ago, I used the same slide, and Governor Schwarzenegger was in the green room afterwards, and he said, "Larry, that one slide you used saying that we'd have 105 more days is wrong." And I said, "How so, Governor?" He said, "Here in California, we don't have a fire season anymore. Any day of the year, we can have a super fire in the state of California. We no longer have a fire season." And that's true. We're also seeing a very dramatic decline in the amount of water in our major rivers. The Colorado River, for example, which is vital for the water supply for everything from Arizona all the way to California, is in decline. I took this photograph. The two big dams on the Colorado are losing their water, and we're seeing just an enormous effort to try to reclaim as much water as they possibly can because the downstream communities are in serious trouble and will be largely uninhabitable in decades ahead if we don't get a handle on this. We're also seeing more lightning strikes, about 10% more lightning strikes than we used to have. And of course, that feeds the fire warnings that we've been talking about. 8 of the 10 largest fires in California have burned in the past decade. We've all witnessed the terrible tragedies to many people and to communities that have lost everything. I look at this Golden Gate Bridge, and I know the landscape behind that bridge that's on fire right now, and I've hiked it, and it breaks my heart to see this kind of damage. And of course, the damage being done to the forest finds its way into communities, and we see enormous destruction. Incidentally, there's a problem with the way fires are being fought in some of these communities. The insurance industry picks off those houses that are most valuable, and they actually park their own fire trucks in the driveway of these high valued homes because it's cheaper for them to fight that fire at that house than it is to lose that house. That does not happen to the average homeowner, but it surely happens to the wealthy. And so in places where you have high wealth, you also have this insurance industry driven fire system that actually goes out and protects their structures. We also are seeing derechos popping up, these straight line storms. Last year, it caused massive damage in the Midwest to our corn crop, and we're expecting to see more of those kind of major events across the planet. Coral reefs and phytoplankton are also in trouble. The Great Barrier Reef is in trouble, as are all the other coral reefs. It turns out that when you put the carbon in the ocean, it turns into carbonic acid when it comes down in rainfall. And that acid actually ties up the calcium that's needed for coral development and also for the bone development and shell development of all the critters in the ocean. So everything from phytoplankton, zooplankton, to fish and to shellfish are all in jeopardy, as are the coral in the various parts of our planet. Total phytoplankton, incidentally, phytoplankton produces about 70% of our oxygen. So phytoplankton is already down by 40%. So think about that a minute. Here's the the mechanism that produces 70% of our oxygen, and it's down by nearly half. And so what does that say for our long-term future in terms of oxygen production? What does that say for the health of the ocean? This is the bottom of the food chain in the ocean. The zooplankton eat the phytoplankton, and other organisms eat the zooplankton. And we see the food chain for the oceans. And so we're seeing a decline in overall fishery production throughout the planet. And it's because of this failure of the phytoplankton and the rest of the food chain to provide the food materials that they need to survive. So carbonic acid, warmer waters, and also excess nutrients in dead zones are really having enormous damage, causing enormous damage to our oceans, and needs to be properly addressed. We're seeing dead zones and hypoxic zones in the ocean as a result of human pollution and all the other forces that are at work. The oxygen levels are dropping, and fish can't survive when there's no oxygen, and we see major fish kills in various places. Rachel Carson in 1950, the year I was born, warned that we are in our own lifetime witnessing a startling alteration of climate. And she saw that because she watched the life of fish and wildlife across the planet and recognized that they were changing their homeland and moving further north in the northern hemisphere, further south in the southern hemisphere. And she wrote a chapter in that first book, now 71 years ago, that talked about this. Since that time, we now know that if the temperature continues to go up, we're going to lose about 30% of all plant and animal life on the earth. And if it goes up by 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 3 to 4 degrees Celsius, we're going to lose between 40 and 70% of all species on the planet. So global warming, as well as all these other forces that are at work, are causing ecosystem breakdown, and humans are at the top of that ecosystem. And so we need to be concerned about what's happening to our plants and animals around the planet. It turns out that animals and plants actually need to move further north every day by about 27 to 45 feet to stay even with the changing climate system. And I don't know about the plants that you look at, but I've been watching an oak tree in my yard, and it hasn't moved an inch. And so we're seeing our plant species move out of their biomes. Currently, the plant life can possibly move as much as 15 feet per day, but certainly not at the rate that it's needed. So all plants, all trees, all animals, all bird life need to move. And Audubon and others are showing us that the bird life is moving into new places, and we're seeing some of those patterns begin. But wildlife are in trouble. Their habitats are at risk from changing climate. I've witnessed the polar bears in the Arctic region and understand that they are they're having food shortages because they don't have the ice habitats that they once had to get their food. We're also seeing walruses crowding and disappearing across, again, the same North region. Robins are arriving 10 days earlier. In fact, they're still here. Robins have not left the region. I recently saw a flock of robins just the other day. Butterflies are advancing their first flights by 24 days, which means that they're going to get out of sync with the food that they need to survive. Tree swallows are laying their eggs earlier. And turtles are interesting because they do not have an X and Y chromosome. They actually reproduce by temperature. As they lay eggs in the soil, the temperature of the soil determines whether they're going to have male or female eggs. As the soil warms up, we're going to see more female turtles and less male turtles. So clearly they're having to change their range or just to disappear as the planet warms. Caribou are now extinct in the lower 48 and are having trouble in the Arctic region as we develop energy in those regions. The snowshoe hare has largely disappeared from Pennsylvania. We don't see them here anymore. There may be a rare one discovered, but not very many, and not like we once had. Brook trout are also in rapid decline. We can see from this map the only really good brook trout range that we still have left is in Maine and some of the northern parts of New York and the northern parts of this country. Moose cannot handle stress. The heat stress actually takes them out. So we're seeing a decline of moose in the two states where we had most of our moose, Minnesota and also Maine. And both of those states are reporting steep declines in their moose populations. We're also seeing declines in the pronghorn antelope, which has been around for eons. The antelope is probably the most recognizable species of the West, and yet their habitat is going to shrink to a couple counties in Wyoming as the temperatures warm. So the point I want to make in all this is that if the pot is boiling over, who would turn up the heat? And in fact, that's what we've been doing in the last 4 years. We've been literally turning up the heat on the planet by relaxing environmental rules, by overthrowing rules designed to phase out coal, to basically unleash the fossil fuel industry in a way that we've not seen in recent presidencies. So we're facing a time when our pollution regulations have been relaxed when they should have been tightened, and it's causing an incredible impact on our planet. Some mistakes are no big deal. Global warming is not one of those. We're going to have a long season of trouble as we continue to fail to act on climate change. Our young people are giving voice to our concerns. We need to listen to them. I have had an opportunity to speak to a couple of the gatherings, the school strikes gatherings here in Pittsburgh and elsewhere. And I'm so proud that our young people are giving voice to this urgent issue. The best science says we have about 10 years to drop the pollution levels dramatically. We're seeing all the signs that we're headed for serious trouble if we fail to do that. Unlike other pollutants, climate pollution does not go away easily. We stopped acid rain, and within a couple of years, we weren't getting the pHs that we were getting in previous rain events. But that's not the case with climate pollution. The carbon dioxide is going to be in the sky for a long time, and we'll need our immediate action to protect the planet. Interestingly enough, the cost of clean energy is dropping very rapidly. And in fact, the cost of solar with batteries is now approaching the point where it's going to cross over into natural gas territory within a year. We're seeing wind is already there. Both wind and solar with batteries have passed coal a long time ago, and nuclear isn't even close. So the best and cheapest way to get out of our trouble is to insulate, to find better ways of moving energy around through an advanced distribution system, and to invest in these new clean technologies. And by doing that, we can make all of our lives better, and we can create an enormous number of new jobs. I love what's happened to LED light bulbs. I happen to be sitting under some now, and I'm sure many of you do too, because we've seen a tremendous fall in their prices and a tremendous increase in their reliability, and they save enormous amounts of energy. And they are part of our solution, but certainly not the only part of that. California's been moving rapidly ahead. I've spent a number of times with the number of hours with the leaders in California, and have seen the investments that are being made in California. And they use about half as much energy as we do today, and they are producing enormous amounts of energy from clean energy, and are doing very well in their efforts to make our planet a better place. Because if you live in California and are suffering from the fires and the dangers of California, you know how important it is to invest in clean energy. There are currently 5 times as many jobs in solar as there is in mining. And yet we hear so much about mining jobs, when in fact, our best shot is to employ the solar industry and give more people jobs to outfit our homes, our businesses, our parking lots, our shopping centers with solar. And I think President-elect Biden, when he is in place, will lead that charge. He is very committed to that. I've talked to him many times in the past about these things, and I know how passionate he is about moving us in a clean energy direction. We're also going to see an explosion of electric automobiles. They're much cheaper to operate. I drive a Tesla, and I can tell you, I have not had to have any maintenance on my car, and I've had it several years now. There's no exhaust system, there's no spark plugs, there's no carburetor. There's all these things that transmissions, all these things that used to give us trouble are no longer on the car because we're relying on electric motors and a battery. And the software technology is advancing every day. We get regular updates on our technology, so we continue to be moving in the right direction. And this is what a fueling station is going to look like in the future. And I predict it'll be a not too distant future because the cost of solar is collapsing. As I mentioned, it's even cheaper than that today. The wind energy has expanded quite dramatically. GE, for example, just photographed a new wind turbine that they're building that will be the largest in the world. Slow moving, so it won't kill birds the way the old ones did. And it will produce enormous amounts of energy with every turn of its blades. We also have an opportunity to have farmers be helped by putting carbon back into soils. When our ancestors first plowed soil in Pennsylvania and around the United States, the soil was very black. And that was because it had a lot of carbon stored there. The carbon has been unfortunately burned out of the soil through fertilizers and through tillage and through mismanagement of soils. And so we've lost that carbon. And by putting that carbon back in our soils, we can bring it out of the sky and put it back to where it belongs. And it turns out that when you put carbon back in the soils are more resistant to erosion. So we have cleaner water coming off of these farmlands. It's also more productive during droughts and high rainy seasons. Carbon tends to be a sponge holding moisture during dry periods. This happens to be a field that was 5% carbon versus 1%. And you can see how dramatically different it is on the left side because of the carbon that is in that soil that holds moisture and produces crops even during a drought. We also know how to do a lot of techniques today to put more carbon back in the soil. Winter cover crops with special crimpers can create a mulch to allow corn to grow without herbicides. We know the health implications of the herbicides that we're using, Roundup and these other herbicides are very damaging to our bodies. And we can grow crops without that if we do the right thing and build soils as we're going. So we need to reduce our carbon emissions very dramatically, as I mentioned before. When I was working in Washington, we could cut our emissions by about 10% a year, or 2% a year. Today, we need to cut them by about 10% a year in order to avoid a catastrophic climate event. I've solarized my home. This happens to be my solar panels. It also substitutes for a storage shed. But I also have electric cars, so I'm committed to doing everything possible to change the outcome. I grow an organic garden, put carbon back in my soils. So I believe in all these things. I know they work. I know they're possible. And I would urge you all to do the same. I believe very strongly that organic gardening, carbon positive food production is possible, and it's healthy and can give us many years of carbon reduction that we desperately need. We also need to put over 1 trillion trees back on the planet to help capture carbon and do a number of other things to protect our vital critical habitats. So we all need to work together to support Biden's climate and energy policies as they come forward. I'm an admirer of Marjory Stoneman Douglas. Most of us know her name by the high school that had that tragic event with children being shot and others being wounded. But Marjory, and I think her kids must have seen this quote on her wall somewhere, but she said that this is her in challenge to all of us. Be a nuisance where it counts. Do your part to inform and stimulate the public to join your action. Be depressed, discouraged, and disappointed at failure and the disheartening effects of ignorance, greed, and corruptions and bad politics, but never give up. I knew Marjory when she was 90 and she lived to be 102 years old, and she was a great champion for the Everglades. But more than that, she was a voice for public engagement and changes. There's an upcoming meeting for fracking, and I would urge you to be a part of that. We're going to have a press conference on the 14th of January. So there's a number of things happening. Biden and Kamala Harris will be sworn in soon. They will come out with a very strong climate plan. Please support their work. This is my grandson. He and his cousins and brother deserve a better world than what we're giving them. And so I'm committed to their future. I think a good person, this is from Proverbs, a good person leaves an inheritance to his children's children. And I believe very strongly that we do. We owe it to them to protect their future. Our children deserve a better world than we're going to give them if we don't act. And they deserve the protection of nature as well. So with that, I'll stop and open up for any questions that you might have. I would also ask that if you're interested, I have a new book called Climate Crisis and Corrupt Politics. The corrupt politics part of it is probably as relevant today as it's ever been. But clearly, I tried to bring attention to what was going on in Washington, and we now can see it. But this gives you a list of things that we can do to change the outcome of both the climate crisis and the political situation we currently face. So thank you.
Larry, thank you very, very much. You know, I want to let you know that you know, this was just a fantastic presentation, and I also want you to know that we've had 20 questions already come in. There's lots and lots of questions, and so one of the ones that has come in 3 or 4 different ways. You know that, and we talked yesterday that St. Brendan's is very committed to Black Lives Matter.
Yes.
In fact, that is what actually got us propelled into our forums. And so I wonder if you could spend, you know, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 minutes, you know, just letting us know, how do the issues of climate change affect our lower income people, you know, our people, you know, who are living around the fracking plant in Beaver County? You know, what does that mean, and how does that affect, you know, people of color? And what do we need to know about that?
Well, I would point to Pastor William Barber, who has started the Poor People's Campaign. He's picking up on the campaign that Martin Luther King left behind in his death. But he's added a new leg to that campaign, and he's added the leg of environmental protection. Because William Barber, having grown up in North Carolina and have seen the terrible consequences of pollution on poor people, both poor whites as well as African Americans, as well as Latinos. And Barber has really been a champion, in my mind, of the very cause that you're talking about. And I would really urge you to plug in to his work, because he's really an outstanding voice for these issues. We have actually partnered with Pastor Barber. Al Gore is a longtime advocate for these issues and has been deeply concerned for many, many years about how, particularly how pollution has been thrust on to poor communities. You know, if you look at where the disposal wells are being located, or where the power plants have been located, or where landfills are placed, they go where there's the least resistance. And that's oftentimes where people don't have the money to push back. And so they know demographically where they can go and get away with this kind of nonsense. And they've done it for years. And so as a result, we have people who live nearby who have high cancer rates. I've visited Cancer Alley down in Louisiana many times. I've talked to people in the Cancer Alley who have cancer, who are suffering. And I know that their health conditions are directly related to the plastic and fossil fuel industries in that region. So I think the two issues are deeply connected, and I'm proud that Climate Reality and the Poor People's Campaign with Pastor Barber are connected and are walking together on this important issue, because it's certainly vital. And I would also say there are more African Americans standing up for the environment than ever before. And if you poll them, 80% of the African Americans have, for about 10 or maybe 15 years, have called for swift action on climate change. More than any other segment, more than any other group in America, the African American community have been very strong in their voice on this issue.
Larry. And here's a more targeted question, and I think you did give some input, kind of like hit on this a little bit, but it's a very direct question. Here it is. Does climate change affect Black and brown communities more than others? If so, why?
Well, if you look at most communities, the places where they tend to end up are places that are highly at risk for flooding. They're along the river corridors, for example. They're also in coastal regions. If you go down to Louisiana, I can tell you, you can go to places in Louisiana that are only a half a foot from sea level, and you'll find minorities living there in great numbers. And I would also point out that we have mistreated the American Indians, the first people of this country. The Native Americans deserve our attention, and we have allowed many abuses on their lands. Mining of uranium, for example, has occurred on tribal lands. The mining of gold, of course, has taken tribal lands. We have just done so many things as a nation. And right now, the Gwich'ins are fighting tooth and nail to avoid drilling in the Arctic refuge. They rely on the caribou herds that live there, and they treat the Arctic refuge as sacred place. Just like you would treat your church, they see the Arctic refuge, particularly the coastal plain where the caribou raise their young, as a sacred place. It's so sacred in their minds that they're not even allowed to enter. It's like the Holy of Holies for them. And so they won't even go on the land that we're about to drill under the Trump edict for oil when we don't need it, when we don't want it. And so I think we have a lot to make amends for, but we have a lot to do to stop some of these abuses to these places. I was in the Arctic village with a Gwich'in elder, and I looked over and he had tears in his eyes talking about what the oil companies were going to do to this sacred place. He said, they offered us $30 million to sign an agreement that we would support this development. And he said, we could have used that money for a sewage and water system and for all the things that we need in our community. But every one of my members voted no to do this. So they're willing to stand up. We need to be willing to stand up for them.
Thank you, Larry. We have 2 or 3 questions around this issue. What organizations have the best track record for achieving change related to the climate crisis, or they're champions of climate-friendly actions in Pittsburgh in particular that we might want to reach out as allies with?
Well, I think there are a number of organizations that are working on climate change. I give a lot of credit to the League of Conservation Voters in Washington, the Sierra Club. Sierra Club's been steadfast in their efforts. Here in Pennsylvania, Penn Future, an organization that I used to lead, continues to be really strong on those issues. The Breathe Project is going after pollution, but as a part of that, understands that climate change is interwoven with air pollution. So they've been a force. There are a number of great organizations. I think GASP, I could get on a list. It's not a matter of one being over the other. It's a matter of picking an organization that you prefer to work with and do your part supporting them as they fight the battle, because they all work together. They all try to do the same thing.
Thank you. There's another particular here, it's about the Shell Palmer plant will require 1,000 frac wells per year to operate at full capacity.
Yep.
This plant will contribute 2 million tons of CO2 per year. It feels like we are doomed. What do we do?
Well, the Shell plant is something I fought hard against. It's one of the things that I talked about when I mentioned our former member of the House, Speaker Turzai. This plant is a natural gas or fossil fuel hog. It actually relies on liquid frac gases. So there's a certain area that will be drilled, and when it opens up, it will create a real surge of frac wells all over this region. I fear they're going to go after North Park. It is not protected right now and needs protection. But more than that, I think you're going to see an enormous amount of new drilling as a result of this plant. And the sad part of it is we don't need any more plastic. We have enough plastic. We need to end plastic pollution, not create more plastic bags that end up in our rivers, end up in our oceans, end up degrading our environment. The other thing about plastic is that we now know that we have plastic that deteriorates slowly, and it ends up being microplastic and in human bodies. We're all carrying plastic around inside our bodies as a result of the plastic pollution that we currently live with. So I've done everything I can. This plant is currently being finalized, and at some point will be operational, and will be polluting our air, degrading our environment, and it's been allowed to happen. It's been snuck through, frankly, by the lawmakers before the public had a chance to react to it.
Thanks, Larry. How is our city and state governments monitoring carbon emissions?
Well, the best monitoring has historically come from EPA. Our local government here in Allegheny County has air pollution monitors, and they're helpful. It's not so much a monitoring, it is acting on the pollution incidents and making sure we have the proper standards in place. But more than that, I think it's time for an energy transition. I know the governor is working on trying to get Pennsylvania to be a part of the RGGI, which is the Regional Asset Group. And I think RGGI is a really important tool that will be used to reduce carbon emissions. All the northeastern states are using RGGI and are seeing their economies are doing really well and their carbon pollution is going down. We need to be a part of that, and it needs to happen before Governor Wolfley's office.
I have a question here, and it's a very short one, and it's an opinion. Looking for an opinion on Earth Justice.
Earth Justice is an organization that has been, it actually came out of the Sierra Club. There used to be an organization called Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund, and that group sprung off from Sierra Club and became Earth Justice. They are the lawyers for the environmental movement. While other groups file lawsuits, Earth Justice is clearly the leader in that space and deserves enormous credit for the work that they do. I've worked closely with Earth Justice over the years, and think highly of their really skilled lawyers who are frankly working sacrificially. These people could be making a lot more money in the private sector representing but they've decided to work to protect our environment and have not made the kind of money that they could make had they been on another side of the table.
Thank you. Here's one that I'm going to. It's well written here, very well written, and very reflective. And so I want to give you the whole thing, and then see what you how you respond to this. Poor whites were exploited under the same conspiracy that kept former slaves as inferior creatures. A poor white was conditioned to understand that as long as he or she wasn't black, he or she was superior. So the natural allies of urban poor, people of color, is the rural white poor, or as they prefer to call themselves, the working class, who consistently vote against their own interests due to the consistently. Let me just consistently vote against their own interests due to the complicated history of race and caste in this country.
Yep.
So here's the question then. How do we break through the polarity and begin to create black-white working class alliance around climate?
That's exactly what Al and Reverend Barber are working on. Barber, when he speaks, he's very careful to talk about those very same white poor people that you're referring to, because they should be natural, I believe, through a really sad set of situations. And I must pause for a second and say, I really revere the Pope. I think the Pope has touched a very special place in this world. And above all popes that I've ever been exposed to, this man cares for the poor. He cares deeply for our world. He knows that climate change is a desperate threat. And he's really challenging the church And you have responded to that challenge, I might say. But he's challenged the church to think differently. And in my many years being in multiple churches, being on the boards of churches, I have been heartbroken by the division that we see in our churches. We have white churches and black churches. That's crazy. And it's just a heartbreaker, because so many white poor people think that because they've been misled, have been told that black people are taking their jobs, that immigrants are taking their jobs, and that's who their enemy is, when in fact their enemy is, if they have one, is really the system that allows for salaries to be depressed, allows for unfair tax system, and all the other things that we're witnessing today. And that system needs to be broken, needs to be fixed. And until we all can unite, white and black together, we cannot fix a broken democracy. My book really goes into great detail about this, but we've seen voter suppression, we've seen voter abuses, and we've seen a very carefully crafted overthrow of what was a very healthy democracy. And we're witnessing that in this very day. And there's a lot of ignorant people who are following the carefully crafted words and messages from people who have another agenda, frankly. And it's not a healthy agenda for this nation.
Thank you for that, Larry. Here's two that kind of get similar questions. So how do we encourage Pennsylvania and U.S. legislators to reduce the amount of fracking? And then should we contact our county council to create protections in North Park from fracking? So especially with regard to them being fixated on jobs for their constituents instead of moving forward with working on climate change. So any tips on how to approach some of our state and local leaders?
Well, I think we have a system, unfortunately, in Pennsylvania with gerrymandering, where a lot of these lawmakers are in what I'd call bulletproof districts, where they've carefully drawn the lines. You know, in the old days, a bunch of lawmakers or politicians would sit around a room and argue over districts, and they would be smoking cigars and drawing lines, and no one really knew what they're doing. So we ended up having more fair districts because we didn't have a sophisticated system. Today, we know there's so much data out there on every person in this country. We know how people vote. And so if you put all that data together, you can carefully craft a district that's protected. So we need to fix that system, as well as fixing the political situation we have in Harrisburg and in Washington. I spent 10 years in the state legislature, and during that time as a chief staff member of the House Senate Environmental Committee. And during that time, we passed 28 major environmental laws. And we don't have that kind of legislature right now. So it really requires us to start thinking about how we're going to make sure that our votes count and make sure that others join us in changing the outcome of these elections. Because if you don't have a good lawmaker, you can't make a difference. Now, we do have a good lawmaker in Senator Toomey. I also think Connor Lamb will do the right thing when given the chance. We've seen in recent days that he's developed a pretty stiff backbone. And surprisingly, our other senator Toomey is starting to turn in a direction that's much healthier than it had been. So I would urge you to really press on your state legislator, press on your state senator. Make sure your U.S. senators and your Congress members know how you feel about these issues. And particularly as we move into the first 100 days of the Biden administration, we really need to get climate passed. I can tell you, I'll tell you a very personal story. Al Gore and I were walking through the U.S. Capitol, through the Rotunda area that we saw in the news in the last couple of days. And then Senator Joe Biden comes running over to Al and he says, "Al, I need to talk to you for a second." And he said, "Al, are you going to," this was back in 2007. And he said to Al, "Are you going to run for president again?" He said, "Because if you are, I will not run, because I believe very strongly that we need a strong climate policy, and I know you would make that happen. I care too much for you to run against you." And Al turned to him and said, "Joe, I'm not running anymore. I'm finished after 2000. That was my last attempt." And Joe said, "Okay, then I will run." And that's the guy that we have now entering the White House. And I can assure you, he gets climate change. And 40% of the state of Delaware that he's represented for his entire lifetime is going to go underwater because it's so close to the sea level. He knows that, and he doesn't want that to happen. He loves that state, and he loves this nation. So I think we have great opportunity in the President of the United States to witness a climate policy that will get the job done for the first time in my lifetime.
That's incredibly hopeful. Thank you for that. We are a bit over time, but there's two more really quickly. I just want to get in there and just let the audience know that in case you need to leave, please do that. Just two real quickies here. One of them is this. It sounds to me like the person who's writing this would like to become empowered and be able to speak to this criticism. And it's the critic who cites that if you study history on environment, you will see that we have had these situations millennia ago, and this is just a repetition of what's just very natural to our world. And so how do we combat that? Do you have any tricks? Like for example, I saw a term that I was not familiar with, and I don't even know. I kind of like wrote it down after the fact. That derachis, is that it? Those winds that come or whatever.
Yeah.
That is. I've never heard that term before.
Yeah.
And so is there any new stuff that we can give that we definitely know didn't happen a million years ago that people can criticize our current concerns?
Well, scientists have actually looked at that question about whether we're going into a warming phase on the planet. We've seen an undulation in our climate system, a natural undulation in our climate system that has occurred over literally tens of thousands of years. So the last time we had an ice age was about 11,000 years ago. And we've seen this, we've been moving into a warmer period. And technically right now, from what the scientists have clearly documented, we should be moving into a colder period on the Earth. But because we're putting so much carbon in the sky, we've reversed that natural undulation. And in fact, have taken it much more radically in a direction where it hasn't been seen for literally several million years. So we have more carbon in the sky today than we had for probably 2 to 3 million years. So what that means is that the carbon dioxide traps the escape of infrared heat. So the temperatures continue to climb because of carbon dioxide and methane and other greenhouse gases. And the science is very solid on that. There's no dispute anymore. There hasn't been the dispute was artificial. It was clearly made up by the industry. And even now we know that they knew back in the 60s. I mean, ExxonMobil has now been, the old Exxon company, the Esso company, has been exposed for having known the truth about climate change since 1962, for goodness sakes. So that we have this evidence out there. There's enormous number of documented place. Skeptical Science, if you go to the website Skeptical Science, you have a question, ask them. They have a whole library of information that you can read and study and find out what's really going on in our world. So there's just an enormous amount of evidence available. Every nation in the world even have joined in the cause to avoid climate change. And the U.S. needs to get back into Paris. I'm confident. I happen to know Senator John Kerry, who now was Secretary of State and now Special Envoy. And Secretary Kerry is someone who I know will do everything he can to rebuild the trust in the Paris Accord and in the solutions that will come out of the next agreement that will include the United States. And hopefully at some point we can get back into a meaningful and leadership role in that effort.
Thank you very much. This is not a question, but I do want to acknowledge St. Brendan's and the Unitarian Universalist Church right down the street. We're neighbors and friends, and we are connecting together and partnering. One of our messages came here that the director of the Breathe Project, Matt Mahalik,
Yep.
in North Hills, he's down the street from us, and he'd be a good speaker on this as well. And I just want to do a shout out to our brothers and sisters, you brothers and sisters. We just love our relationship with you.
Well, Matt is a good friend, and I believe highly in Matt's work. I think he would make a great speaker. Matt puts his focus primarily on making sure that people in the Pittsburgh region have healthy air, and I work with him when I can, and just think highly of his efforts.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Larry, for this informative, practical evening and for motivating us to take the next steps.
Well, thank you.
Let everyone know, you remember Larry's book, Climate Crisis and Crop Politics. There's a link to it in the chat. There's also a number of links to a variety of things that came up during the question and answer period. So I would ask you, if you're so interested, just to make sure you get them from the chat. So before I wrap up, I want to also acknowledge the great work that Donna Ayala from St. Brendan's Social Justice Ministry and Karen Dennis from St. Brendan's Speaker Series are doing to guide St. Brendan's as we respond to issues of anti-racism and climate justice. Thank you to all who have submitted questions during this forum, and to Pastor Julie Smith, who was working tirelessly away in the background to handle the technical aspects of this forum. She always does wonders for us. Thank you, Julie. In an hour-long program, of course, we can at best only scratch the surface of an issue as complex and stubborn as climate crisis. So St. Brendan's will continue working on it and anti-racism in the weeks and the months ahead. Your easiest way to keep up with future programming is simply to visit our website from time to time. The URL is easy to remember. It's www.stbrendans.org. stbrendans.org. And we will post there and on our Facebook page news of our activities and future forums and plans. Our next forum is scheduled for, and you'll see it, it's 1 month from today on a Tuesday, and we are co-sponsoring it actually with our Unitarian brothers and sisters. And so it will be a evening on police issues. And I just don't have it in front of me, but please look at our website for that, which is coming up in 1 month from now. So again, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Larry. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for the opportunity.
You are welcome. And have a good evening, everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you.